Imagine being the most untouchable thief in the kingdom until you mock the wrong man. This is the story of Ronan the Shadow, who thought he was playing the game but was actually being played. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic storytelling. Comment below and let me know, where in the world are you watching from? The kingdom of Velmoria stood as a beacon of prosperity, its towering spires gleaming under the golden sun. The city pulsed with life. Merchants haggled in the markets, street performers dazzled onlookers, and nobles paraded through the grand avenues adorned in silks and jewels. But beneath its veneer of order and civility lurked a shadow, a name that sent both excitement and irritation rippling through the city. Ronan the Shadow. A thief of unparalleled skill, Ronan was more than just a menace, he was a legend. His daring heists were whispered about in hushed tones, his cunning outwitting even the sharpest of minds. But it wasn't just his ability to steal that made him infamous, it was his mockery. Ronan didn't simply rob his targets, he humiliated them. He left behind taunting messages, riddles, and, on occasion, staged elaborate pranks that turned nobles and guards alike into the laughingstock of the city. His latest act of audacity, stealing the ceremonial sword of Captain Aldric, the most revered and feared leader of the royal guard. Under the cover of darkness, Ronan infiltrated the royal barracks, bypassing the intricate network of traps and patrols as if it were mere child's play. The sword, an heirloom passed down through generations of captains, was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the guard's strength. And now it was gone. In its place, Ronan had left behind a single note written in elegant, almost theatrical handwriting. Perhaps you should guard your own belongings before protecting the kingdom. The insult was precise and personal, aimed directly at Captain Aldric's pride. The city awoke to a scandal. The royal guard, undefeated in battle, had been outwitted in their own domain. Whispers spread like wildfire through the streets, turning into laughter in the taverns. Meanwhile, Ronan basked in his victory. That night, deep within the Crimson Flask, a notorious underground tavern hidden beneath the city's old aqueducts, Ronan sat at the center of attention. The dimly lit chamber was filled with thieves, mercenaries, and outcasts, all raising their tankards to the man who had made a fool of the kingdom's most feared warrior. "To Velmoria's greatest fool!" Ronan toasted, his voice dripping with amusement as he took a long swig of ale. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. Coins clinked against wooden tables as bets were placed on what Ronan would steal next. Some speculated he would go after the king's crown. Others joked he should steal Aldric's armor while he slept. Amidst the laughter and revelry, a hooded figure in the corner remained silent, watching. Ronan was too caught up in his own glory to notice. He had pulled off the perfect heist, and in his mind, there would be no consequences. But what he didn't realize was that his game had just begun, and this time, he was no longer the one in control. The grand hall of Velmoria's palace was bathed in golden light, its towering stained glass windows casting a kaleidoscope of colors upon the polished marble floor. At the center of the vast chamber stood Captain Aldric, a man of unshakable discipline, his silver-trimmed armor gleaming under the chandelier's glow. The assembled guards braced themselves, expecting rage, perhaps even a swift execution of the soldiers who had failed to protect his treasured sword. But Aldric did not shout. Instead, he simply smiled, a rare and unsettling expression that sent a chill through the room. The captain's cold blue eyes flicked across the gathered men. Some of them shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. A smile from Aldric was not a sign of amusement. It was a sign that something far worse was coming. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. "Do not chase him." Murmurs rippled through the guards. One of the younger soldiers stepped forward, confused. "But Captain, Aldric cut him off with a mere glance. "Do not increase patrols. Do not set traps. Let him think he's winning." He turned toward the grand window overlooking the city, his gaze fixed upon the flickering lanterns of the lower districts. There, somewhere in the depths of Velmoria's underworld, Ronan the Shadow was celebrating his latest victory. Aldric's smile deepened. Instead, we watch, we learn, and we wait. As the weeks passed, Ronan continued his brazen heists, reveling in the apparent incompetence of the royal guard. He looted noble estates, bypassing their enchanted locks as though they were mere nuisances. He stole the duke's signet ring, replacing it with a forged copy that went unnoticed for days. He even infiltrated the city's treasury, leaving behind gold coins arranged into an elaborate message that read, "Better luck next time." The people of Velmoria laughed at the guard's failure. Taverns echoed with songs of Ronan's cunning, and even merchants began selling crude wooden carvings of the thief, mockingly holding Aldric's sword over his shoulder. Basking in his newfound legendary status, Ronan believed the guards were utterly humiliated. Too slow, too predictable, too weak to stop him. He was wrong. They were never humiliated. They were never slow. They were simply waiting. While Ronan indulged in his arrogance, Captain Aldric and his most trusted men worked in the shadows. They studied his every move, every heist, every escape route, every pattern. Nothing was left to chance. They discovered where he sold stolen goods, who his informants were, and even where he went to drink after a successful heist. But rather than strike, they let him grow confident, luring him deeper into a trap of his own making. Patience, Aldric reminded his men. Let him believe he is untouchable. The greater his arrogance, the harder he will fall. And so they waited until Ronan set his sights on the grandest prize of all, the king's crown. And with that, Aldric's smile finally faded. It was time to strike. For the first time in years, Ronan felt uneasy. It started with little things, things most wouldn't notice. A beggar he frequently bribed for information vanished overnight, his usual spot near the old fountain now occupied by someone unfamiliar. The man claimed not to know who Ronan was asking about. A coincidence? Perhaps. Then there were the hidden tunnels, his personal escape routes, the underground veins of the city. They had always been untouched, known only to a select few. But now, something felt off. Dust had been disturbed, footprints barely visible in the torchlight, and in one passage, a section of stone had been slightly shifted, as if someone had been searching. The city's markets were always alive with gossip, but the usual mockery of the royal guard's failures had faded. The laughter, the crude songs about his exploits, they had quieted. It was as if no one dared to speak too freely anymore. At first, Ronan shrugged it off. The guards were a joke, after all. If they had finally started patrolling smarter, it didn't matter. He was still too fast, too clever, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Something was different. Instead of retreating, instead of taking time to disappear, Ronan did the opposite. He became bolder. If the guards were learning, he would simply stay ahead. And so, he set his sights on his greatest heist yet, stealing the king's crown. The royal gala was the perfect stage. The nobility, the merchants, the diplomats, all would be there. The guards would be spread thin, too busy ensuring the safety of the guests to watch the palace vaults. This would be the ultimate insult. If he succeeded, it would prove, once and for all, that Velmoria's so-called elite were nothing more than armored fools. Let them whisper. Let them scheme. Let them patrol the streets all night. They can't catch me, Ronan thought, a smirk curling on his lips. I'm Ronan the Shadow. What Ronan didn't realize, what his arrogance wouldn't let him see, was that this was exactly what Aldric had been waiting for. The trap was already closing. For weeks, Aldric had anticipated Ronan's reaction. He had planted the seeds of paranoia, nudging the thief toward a desperate, reckless move. The vanished beggar? That man had been paid to disappear. The disturbed tunnels? Those had been intentionally marked, just enough to make Ronan notice. The quieted gossip? That was Aldric's doing. His men had warned the people to stop speaking so freely. Everything was intentional. Every move Ronan made had been foreseen, and now Aldric had him exactly where he wanted him. Ronan thought he was making his boldest move yet. He thought he was the one choosing the battlefield. He thought he was about to prove his superiority. But in reality, he was walking straight into the jaws of the beast. The royal guard had never been humiliated. They had been watching. They had been waiting. And now, as the royal gala approached and Ronan prepared for his grandest heist, Aldric was already one step ahead. The trap was set, and soon, the shadow would fall. The royal gala was a grand affair, a spectacle of wealth, power, and illusion. The grand ballroom shimmered under the glow of countless golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors. Nobles swayed to the music of a dozen violinists, their silken garments rippling like waves beneath the warm candlelight. The scent of spiced wine and rare perfumes filled the air, masking the tensions that lurked beneath the surface. For most, the night was about political games and whispered alliances. For Ronan the Shadow, it was about a crown. At the heart of the ballroom, on an ornate pedestal of silver and obsidian, sat the king's crown, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, adorned with emeralds the size of a man's thumb and laced with ancient runes of protection. It was heavily guarded, of course, or so it appeared. 6 armored sentinels stood near the display, their gazes sweeping the room with feigned attentiveness. But Ronan, ever the keen observer, saw the gaps in their patrols, the laziness in their stances. A casual mistake here. A slight distraction there. Too easy. A lesser thief might have hesitated, questioning why the king's most prized possession would be left so poorly guarded. But Ronan was not a lesser thief. Dressed in the deep blue tunic of a foreign noble, his face masked beneath a delicate veil, Ronan moved effortlessly through the crowd. He was just another guest, another aristocrat sipping fine wine and pretending to enjoy mindless courtly gossip. His mark was already chosen, a minor baron from the countryside, a man barely acknowledged by the high-ranking elites. Slipping close to him, Ronan brushed against the noble, just long enough to pluck the enchanted key dangling from his belt. One of the many secrets Ronan had uncovered? The guards weren't the ones managing the magical wards. The nobles were. With the key secured in his sleeve, and the guards blissfully unaware, he drifted toward the crown, his steps perfectly timed with the rhythm of the music. He was unseen, untouchable, until he wasn't. The moment arrived. A quiet corner, a calculated move. With a flick of his wrist, he slipped the key into the hidden slot on the pedestal. A soft click! The magic wards flickered, then faded. The protective glass casing over the crown was now just glass. Ronan smirked. Too easy. He reached out, fingers brushing against the cold gold of the crown. It was his, or so he thought. The first sound was not an alarm, not the rush of guards, not the clash of steel. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Ronan's blood turned cold. Behind him, a shadow detached itself from the opulent decor, stepping forward with calculated ease. Captain Aldric. Dressed in the formal regalia of the royal guard, his piercing blue eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. The man who had been hunted and humiliated for months now stood before Ronan, his smirk unmistakable. "You've been a clever little rat," Aldric mused, his voice a dangerous purr. "But I've had enough of this game." Ronan's heart pounded, his instincts screaming run. But as his eyes flicked around the ballroom, he realized he had nowhere to go. The exits were subtly blocked, guards positioned with surgical precision. The nobles continued to laugh and drink, blissfully unaware that at this very moment, Velmoria's greatest thief was caught in an inescapable snare. And for the first time in his life, Ronan had no idea what to do. And now, it was Aldric's move. The slow, measured echoed through the ballroom like the toll of a funeral bell. Ronan froze, his fingers still hovering above the king's crown. The adrenaline that had once fueled his every move now turned to ice in his veins. From the shadows of the grand chamber, Captain Aldric emerged, his posture relaxed, yet radiating an aura of absolute control. His arms were crossed, his polished breastplate gleaming under the golden chandelier light. His smirk was not one of arrogance, but of certainty, the expression of a man who had already won. "You've been a clever little rat," Aldric drawled, taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. "But I've had enough of this game." Ronan's instincts kicked in. He spun around, eyes darting to the exits, but he never made it. Every door, every corridor, every possible escape route was sealed off. The palace guards, once appearing lazy and incompetent, now stood at full attention, their hands resting on the hilts of their blades. Their formation was perfect. Ronan's chest tightened. This wasn't just a response. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a trap, a masterfully designed, inescapable snare, and he had walked right into it. His jaw clenched as his mind raced. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. "You planned this, from the start," Ronan whispered, the bitter realization sinking in. Aldric let out a low chuckle. "You're not the only one who can set a trap." The air in the ballroom had shifted. The nobles, still laughing and dancing, were blissfully unaware that a battle was about to unfold in their midst. Ronan took half a step back, his body tensed, muscles coiled like a spring. Fight or flight? Flight. Always flight. His mind snapped into action, analyzing every possible route, every weak point in the guard's positioning. If he could create just one distraction, just one moment of chaos. But Aldric had already anticipated this. "I wouldn't," the captain said casually, as if reading his thoughts. He lifted a hand, and immediately more guards stepped forward from the crowd, their swords half drawn. It was then that Ronan noticed something far more troubling. The nobles, some of them weren't nobles at all. The well-dressed men near the pillars, guards in disguise, the musicians at the back, trained operatives. Even some of the servants, their hands resting too carefully by their waists, were carrying concealed weapons. This wasn't just a trap. This was a battlefield, and Ronan had waltzed right into the lion's den. For the first time in his life, Ronan felt the weight of true defeat. Not the kind where you escape by the skin of your teeth. Not the kind where you simply lie low for a while and come back stronger. No, this was the end of the game. Because Aldric hadn't just trapped him physically, he had shattered Ronan's illusion of control. The royal guard had never been incompetent. They had never been humiliated. They had been watching. They had been waiting. And now, they were closing in. Ronan clenched his fists. His mind screamed, "Run!" but his body wouldn't move. Aldric tilted his head, smirking. "What's wrong, thief?" he said softly. "Not so cocky now, are we?" The ballroom felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Ronan's legendary luck had finally run out, and there was only one move left to make. The moment Ronan moved, the ballroom erupted into chaos. Guards lunged, hands reaching for him, but he was already gone. A blur of motion, weaving between them like water slipping through fingers. The soft silk of his noble disguise was shed in an instant, revealing the dark leather armor beneath, his true form emerging. His daggers flashed under the chandeliers, glinting like fangs as he parried the first incoming strike. With a flick of his wrist, he disarmed a soldier, sending the man's sword clattering across the marble floor. He spun, ducked, and sidestepped, faster than the eye could follow. But it wasn't enough, because Aldric was faster. Ronan had fought many men before, guards, bounty hunters, rival thieves, and he had always won. But this was different. Aldric didn't fight with brute strength. He didn't rely on speed alone. He fought with experience, strategy, precision. Every move Ronan made, Aldric was already there, blocking, countering, forcing him into a tighter space. A downward slash, Aldric caught it with his bracer, twisting Ronan's wrist just enough to throw him off balance. A feint to the left, Aldric didn't fall for it. Instead, he stepped into Ronan's space, pushing him back toward the center of the room. A desperate swipe with a dagger, Aldric dodged effortlessly, responding with a brutal elbow to Ronan's ribs. Ronan gasped, stumbling back, his vision flashing white. He wasn't fighting a man, he was fighting a force of nature. The ballroom was no longer a battlefield, it was a cage. Guards surrounded him on all sides, forming an unbreakable perimeter. The air was thick with tension, swords gleaming, footsteps slow and deliberate. Ronan gritted his teeth. "Think, think, think!" His eyes flicked upward, toward the balcony overlooking the ballroom. His last hope. Enough. Aldric's voice cut through the noise, calm and merciless. Ronan lunged, not toward Aldric, but at the nearest guard. In a blink, he snatched a short sword from the man's belt and hurled it with deadly precision at the chandelier above. Glass shattered. The massive chandelier crashed down, sending nobles screaming and guards diving away. In the split second of distraction, Ronan reached into his belt and slammed a smoke bomb against the floor. A thick cloud of black mist exploded through the room, swallowing everything in darkness. Coughs, shouts, confusion. And Ronan? He was already running. He surged forward, blindly sprinting toward the balcony, boots skidding against polished marble. Behind him, Aldric's voice rang out, "Stop him!" But it was too late. With one final desperate burst of speed, Ronan leapt over the railing. The world blurred as he plummeted into the darkness below. A fall too high to survive. A fate that should have ended him. But Ronan had one last trick left. Somewhere beneath the grand palace in the maze-like alleys of Velmoria, a shadow landed without a sound. Ronan exhaled, rolling off the tarp-covered awning that had broken his fall. His ribs ached, his vision swam, but he was alive. He let out a breathless laugh. He had escaped, or so he thought, because as he took his first step toward freedom, a voice drifted from the darkness behind him. Impressive! Ronan froze, his heart slamming against his ribs, because he knew that voice. Aldric was already there, waiting for him. And the game was over. Ronan staggered through the winding back alleys of Velmoria, his breath ragged, his limbs screaming in protest. Blood trickled from a gash above his eyebrow, staining his torn tunic. Every step felt like he was dragging chains. But he was alive. Alive. He had escaped. The rooftops, the hidden passages, the desperate dive from the balcony, all of it had worked. Aldric had been outmaneuvered, or so he thought. At last he reached his hideout, a forgotten safe house nestled behind an abandoned bookshop, its door hidden beneath layers of ivy and crumbling stone. He pressed his back against the cold wood, sucking in air through clenched teeth. He had made it. Fumbling with shaking hands, he unlatched the door and stepped inside, and froze. The room was silent. The familiar scent of aged parchment and burnt-out candles filled the air, but something was wrong. The air was too still. The flickering lantern he always left burning was snuffed out, leaving only the pale silver glow of the moon filtering through the cracked window. Then a slow, deliberate movement, a shifting of weight. Someone was inside. And before Ronan could even react, a voice emerged from the darkness. You should have quit while you were ahead. Ronan's breath caught in his throat. Aldric. The captain sat in the only chair in the room, a dagger idly spinning between his fingers. His armor was gone, replaced by a dark tunic, sleeves rolled up, the picture of calm authority. He didn't lunge, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't need to, because he had already won. Ronan took a slow step back, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. This wasn't possible. I lost you, Ronan managed, his voice hoarse. I shook the guards. Aldric chuckled, shaking his head. Did you? Realization struck Ronan like a blade to the gut. The entire escape, the chase, the rooftop acrobatics, even his grand leap from the palace, it had all been allowed. Aldric had never been trying to catch him there. He had been waiting for this moment, for Ronan to run exactly where he thought he was safe. You didn't escape, thief, Aldric continued, his voice quiet, dangerous. You just walked into the final step of the plan. Ronan's mind raced, searching for an out. A trapdoor, a hidden exit, something. But Aldric saw it in his eyes, the desperate flicker of a man whose options had finally run out. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. This is checkmate, Ronan. The thief's breathing was ragged. He reached for a dagger at his belt, only to find it wasn't there. Aldric smirked and held it up, twirling it effortlessly. Looking for this? Ronan's stomach dropped. He had been disarmed without even realizing it. For the first time in his life, there was no escape. And the worst part? Aldric had never even broken a sweat. The silence between them stretched. Then, after a long pause, Aldric sighed. You're good, Ronan. Damn good. But you made one mistake. Ronan swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. And what's that? Aldric leaned back, eyes sharp with amusement. You thought you were playing the game. And it had never been Ronan. Ronan had always believed he would die on his own terms, not in chains, not on his knees before a king, and certainly not captured like a common criminal. Yet here he was, dragged through the grand halls of Velmoria's palace, his wrists bound in iron, his clothes torn and bloodied from the merciless pursuit of Captain Aldric. The towering golden doors of the throne room swung open, revealing a court of nobles, generals, and advisors, all watching with expressions ranging from amusement to contempt. And at the end of the hall, sitting upon Velmoria's gilded throne, was King Edric IV, his piercing gaze locked onto the defeated thief before him. Ronan straightened, despite the guard's grip on his arms. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him cower. If this was the end, he would meet it with his head held high. The king's voice rang calm and commanding. Ronan the Shadow, he mused, his fingers drumming lazily against the armrest. A name that has become both a legend and a curse within my city. Ronan forced a cocky smirk, despite the pain lacing his ribs. Happy to be of service, your majesty. Murmurs rippled through the court at his insolence. A general scoffed, a noblewoman whispered behind a jeweled fan. But Aldric remained silent, standing a few paces to the side, arms crossed, watching. The king studied Ronan for a long moment before speaking again. You have stolen from my nobles, humiliated my royal guard, defied my laws again and again." His eyes narrowed. Were it up to the court, you would be hanging from the gallows by dawn. Ronan tensed but refused to look away. Then the king glanced at Aldric. "And yet," he continued, "my captain speaks highly of you." A murmur of surprise rippled through the hall. Ronan's brows furrowed. "Highly? Aldric? The same man who had spent months hunting him down?" Before Ronan could question it, Aldric finally spoke, stepping forward. "Your Majesty," Aldric began, his voice measured and steady, "a man with skills like his can rot in the dungeons, or serve the crown where he would be most useful." A heavy silence fell over the court. It took a moment for Ronan to realize what was happening. Aldric wasn't asking for his execution. He was offering him a deal. Ronan laughed, the sound bitter. "Let me guess," he drawled, wincing as he shifted in his restraints. "You want me to spy for you?" Aldric didn't react. "You've spent years outwitting the kingdom's best defenses, slipping through places no man should. That talent doesn't belong in a cell. It belongs on the king's payroll." Ronan's smirk faltered. He had expected death. He had braced for it. But this was something worse. To serve the very system he had spent his life mocking? To become a pawn of the crown instead of its greatest nuisance? His freedom? Gone. And yet, the alternative was rotting away in a dark, forgotten cell. The court watched in silence as Ronan clenched his jaw, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His mind screamed, "Never." His instincts whispered, "Survive." And so, through gritted teeth, he forced the words past his lips. "Fine, I'll do it." Aldric's expression didn't change. The king simply smiled. And the game had just changed. The night was silent, the kind of silence that came before a storm. A lone cloaked figure moved effortlessly through the shadows of Velmoria, slipping between alleys, gliding over rooftops. Each step was careful, calculated, yet this time, not for his own gain. This time, he wasn't running. This time, he was hunting. Ronan never thought he would end up here. Not as a prisoner, not as a pawn of the king. And yet, here he was, weaving through the underbelly of the city with a different goal in mind. For weeks, he had been trained, tested, broken, and rebuilt under Aldric's watchful eye. He was still Ronan the Shadow, still the thief who had outwitted the kingdom's best. But now, he worked for them. It left a bitter taste in his mouth. Yet, as much as he loathed the idea of serving the crown, Ronan knew one thing. Survival was the greatest heist of all. And if this was what it took, he would play the game. He reached a quiet rooftop, pausing for a brief moment to catch his breath. The city stretched out before him, the very city he had once stolen from so effortlessly. Now he protected it, in the only way he knew how. Reaching into his cloak, he pulled out a polished dagger, its surface reflecting his face. The same sharp eyes, the same cocky smirk, but something else lingered beneath. A new edge. A new purpose. Ronan smirked. The game isn't over. He flipped the dagger in his hand, feeling its weight before vanishing into the darkness once more. It's only just begun. But he was still playing to win. Do you think Ronan made the right choice, or was he just trapped in a new kind of cage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more legendary stories.